Thank you for coming. We're honored to have you with us this night. On behalf of Dr. Dina Borai, Dean of the School of Continuing Education, the American University in Cairo, I'd like to welcome you to this event and one of the lecture series, the Dean Lecture Series for this year. We're honored to have Dr. Reem Bassiouney with us today, who is an associate professor at the Department of Applied Linguistics. Dr. Bassiouney received her Master's of Philosophy and Doctorate in Arabic Linguistics from the University of Oxford. She has taught Arabic language and linguistics at universities in the United Kingdom and the United States, including Cambridge, Oxford, and Utah. Her academic books include Functions of Code Switching in Egypt, published in 2006, Arabic Sociolinguistics, 2008, and Arabic and the Media in 2010. She has published numerous articles on Arabic linguistics, including Code Switching, Language and Gender, Leveling, Register, Arabic and Advertisements, Linguistics and Literature, and Language Policies in the Arab World. She is also an award-winning novelist, having received the Sawiris Foundation Award for Young Novelists in 2010. Bassiouney's research interests include sociolinguistics, language and identity, language and mass media, language policy, and discourse analysis. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Bassiouney. Once more, thank you, and we're honored to have everyone with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. I know it's very crowded, and coming here is already doing something heroic, so thank you so much for coming. And I'm really delighted to be here speaking about a topic that is very close to my heart because it's related to identity, to Egypt, and to public discourse. Okay. Now, what I want to discuss today is how do we construct identity? And we have already established in our research that identity is something that is perceptual, habitual, and ideological. So there is a great part of our identity that is really formulated and constructed by public discourse. And public discourse includes our schools, it includes media, and in Egypt specifically, it includes movies, songs, oral culture that we have in our country. As for religion, religion plays a vital role in defining a public identity in the Arab world in general and in Egypt in particular. In the Arab world, religion is an essential part of an individual's identity and defines Arabs' attitudes and moral evaluations. However, on a political level, there has been conflicts in the area that seem to be related to religious affiliations. Two of Egypt's Arab neighbors, Lebanon and Iraq, have suffered from violent religious struggles. And these religious struggles are not even necessarily the product of two distinct religions existing side by side, but could also be born from the conflicts among different sects of the same religion, like in Iraq, Sunnis and Shiites. Egypt has for some time been on the alert in fear of suffering a struggle built on religious differences. Language, as part of the social processes and practices of any culture, has been utilized in public discourse, and mainstream public discourse specifically, to portray an image of a unified Egyptian identity. What I would like to discuss today is how public discourse tackles the issue of religious differences by using two strategies specifically: foregrounding and backgrounding. That is, in public discourse, religious differences are undermined, and religion as a general belief system is highlighted. Religion is foregrounded as an essential, inclusive, and holistic concept that brings all Egyptians together. However, religious differences between Christians and Muslims in Egypt are backgrounded as trivial and not detrimental in identity formation. And this will be clear in the analysis I will do of the movies that I have chosen. Now, to construct these two concepts, public discourse employs language as a resource. Language can be used as a resource to provide a stance that positions individuals as belonging or not belonging to a group. Now, to explain this a little bit more, public discourse attempts to convey the following messages to Egyptians and non-Egyptians: that both religious groups, Christians and Muslims, share the same linguistic practices. These practices are the product of location, class, education, and other social variables that do not include religion. And I'll explain that in a minute. The image conveyed is that we speak the same language, therefore we belong to the same community. Therefore, we are the same people, regardless of our religious affiliation. This discourse also undermines religious differences. The argument is that language variation is not dependent on religion as an independent variable. Therefore, religious differences are not the main marker of Egyptian identity, since all Egyptians form different, small or big communities of practice. Now, the second message is that religion is important, since most Egyptians take religion seriously and are regular attendants of mosques and churches. But that strife between both religious groups is non-existent in public discourse, since they share more salient identity classification categories that include ethnicity. They form the same ethnic group, historical background. They share the same history of colonization, but also the same ancient glory. Locality, they live in the same location. Significantly, they worship the same God. Egypt is mentioned, according to public discourse, in both the Bible and the Quran, which gives Egypt historical backing. The discourse conveys that both Christians and Muslims form one large holistic community of practice, and therefore one Egyptian identity. Now, let me go back to the first claim about linguistic variation, which is not dependent on religion. There are situations in the Arab world where belonging to a specific religion also means that you live in a specific location. So, for example, in Beirut, we had the West and East Beirut at the time of the conflict between Christians and Muslims. And because of this kind of segregation or separation, there is also, develops with it, linguistic variation that is built on religion. Whether it's phonological variation, we're not speaking here about lexical religious words, which of course are different, but we're speaking about phonological, syntactic, and semantic variation. There are actually studies that discuss this in much more detail. So, for example, Abu Haidar examines the differences between what she calls the Muslim Baghdadi Arabic and Christian Baghdadi Arabic. Her study is different from a great number of studies on language variation, since it does not just even explore phonological variables, but also syntactic and semantic ones. There are also studies of the Jews of Iraq and how they speak in a different way. There are other studies about Bahrain, Sunnis and Shiites. There are studies about other parts of the Arab world where, again, religion becomes a kind of community marker. However, as Miller explains, religion as a variable is, in most Arab countries where there are religious minorities, only important because they form communities of practice. Now, Egypt has the largest Christian minority in the Arab world, mainly Copts, but also some Anglicans, Catholics, Russian, and Greek Orthodox. And, the population of Christians only in Egypt would be equal to or more than the population of countries as Jordan, Israel, or Tunisia. Public discourse suggests that religious groups do not necessarily form communities of practice in Egypt. So, they do not do so primarily due to limitations of space, because the population density in Egypt is so high, so they cannot really afford to segregate themselves, but also because there are other variables, sociolinguistic variables, that are more important than religion. And these are, social class, belonging to a country, location, where you come from, and all the other sociolinguistic variables that linguists discuss in relation to linguistic variation. Let me just, before I elaborate a little bit with interesting examples, quote here Bayat, who is a sociologist, anthropologist, and what he said about Egypt in his book. This is about the very dense and multiplex community of Shubra in Cairo. Followers of both faiths invariably stress deep interfaith friendships, in particular among youths of the same sex. Beyond the schools where peer groups are formed, neighborhoods and apartment buildings are places where youngsters establish deep affinity. Male youngsters spend a great deal of time on the street corners, strolling, chatting, seeing movies, sitting in coffee houses, or playing soccer, sometimes very late at night. But young females, both Muslims and Christians, are likely to join together in the privacy of homes to build close associations. This, however, does not mean that religious tension does not erupt from time to time for various reasons. But what is indeed important is that the dense multiplex social network may suggest that language variation in Egypt, especially phonological and syntactic variation, is based on locality, class, gender, and factors other than religion. That is to say, for example, if you come from the southern part of Egypt, Said, both Christians and Muslims will speak a Saidi dialect. And this, as I said, is not necessarily the case in countries like Iraq. If you come from Alexandria, both Christians and Muslims will be speaking an Alexandrian dialect, and the same if you come from Cairo. As I said, this religion is not as essential in that case as it is in Bahrain, Iraq, or Lebanon. Even Hayeri's classic work on gender and social class in Cairo does not really refer to religion as essential or as an essential variable in linguistic variation. Now, it's very interesting for me as a sociolinguist to actually watch movies that we take for granted and we think about as sort of, melodramatic, very nice movies in which Christians and Muslims are hugging each other and shaking hands in very awkward situations just because they come from two different religions, as we will see. But as a linguist, public discourse and media is doing something much more intelligent, as I will show in a minute. Now, the first movie that I will refer to here is a movie that has been produced in 1983, and if there are any Egyptians who have seen this movie, America Shikabika, America, A Fake Dream. Did any of you see that? Okay. In this movie, a group of desperate Egyptians decide to immigrate illegally to the US. Sounds like a very plausible thing. They end up in Romania, hopeless and poverty-stricken. The group comprised of a variety of Egyptians from different walks of life: an educated lower middle-class girl who searches for a better future, an aged teacher, a medical doctor, laborers, and an even old prostitute who wants to find a cure for her daughter's kidney disease. The two main characters, Ahmed, clearly a Muslim name, and Fuad, are different. Ahmed is a lower-class laborer, while Fuad is a medical doctor. Tension increases between them, especially when they compete for the attention of the girl in their group. However, they eventually realize how similar they are. They are both poor, desperate, and humiliated. Eventually, they reconcile. Throughout, the religion of the characters is not mentioned until the aged teacher dies, and they must decide how to bury him. They decide to bury him in a random spot and start praying for him. When Fuad starts his prayer, the audience, as well as Ahmed, realize for the first time that Fuad is in fact a Christian. There was nothing in Fuad's appearance, language, or even neutral name to indicate that. Only during the burial scene, which occurs towards the end of the movie, do the characters in the movie, as well as the audience, realize this. Ahmed then asks, surprisingly, in Egyptian Arabic, the self-evident question, "You're Christian, Fuad?" The surprise of Ahmed is a reflection of the lack of indication of any differences, especially linguistic differences. Ahmed then hugs Fuad in a kind of didactic scene meant to undermine any differences between the two religious groups. Now, I will not show examples of this movie because of time, but I'll show you very interesting and funny examples of another movie, which is Hammam في Amsterdam. Do you know that one as well? Okay. Now, this is a comedy, as you could see. And in this movie, code choice and identity are conspicuous. This is a kind of, the film strikes a chord with Egyptians because it deals with issues that affect a great number of Egyptians: poverty, immigration, and the issue of identity more generally. The protagonist, Hammam, played by the comedian Mohammed Henedi, is the Egyptian par excellence. He's poor yet generous, humorous, resourceful, and persistent. When his fiancée leaves him, he faces frustration at home. So he decides to immigrate to the Netherlands to visit an uncle whom he has never seen. Once there, he faces discrimination and trouble with the law as he experiences a number of adventures. In the meantime, he's struck by the loose network that his uncle and his Dutch wife, family, and children compared to the close relationship Hammam has with his friends and family in Egypt. Throughout the movie, Hammam is on the brink of failure, but he's able to stay afloat. In fact, at the end, he becomes rich and marries a Moroccan Dutch girl. His journey to wealth begins when he shares a house with other poor Arabs and an Egyptian from the south, Said. and he has a good relationship with them all. However, there is only one character in particular who's always there for him, a man who protects him, helps him, and finally becomes his partner in his restaurant. This man, Adrian, is another Egyptian, also from Cairo, but unlike Hammam, he's a Christian. Hammam and Adrian, played by Ahmed al-Saqqa, form the most constructive and close relationship throughout the movie. While Hammam is by nature sympathetic to all those around him, and while there are moments when he calls on the Arabs who share the house with him to forget their difference and start anew, it is only Adrian in whom he trusts and confides. Even the person coming from Said, who's also a Muslim, the southern Egyptian Muslim, does not share with Hammam this affinity and solidarity. It is only the Cairene, Adrian, so that's location, as opposed to religion, Adrian who stays with Hammam until the end. The way the audience is introduced to Adrian is significant on more than one level. When Hammam arrives in the Netherlands, his passport is stolen. He ends up in the police station and struggles to speak English to the police officer, but he's frightened and confused. He starts muttering to himself in Egyptian Arabic when a Moroccan illegal immigrant hears him and says in Moroccan Arabic, "Do not tell them that you're Egyptian." Hammam replies bitterly in Egyptian Arabic, "What shall I say, that I am Dutch?" Realizing that it is impossible for him to change his identity, given that he does not speak the language, nor does he look Dutch, Hammam insists that he is Egyptian and eventually takes his passport. Let's see this specific part because it's interesting linguistically. يعني كده هرسمها. Let me see the other one, perhaps this will work. I could just get it from YouTube, I guess.
ممكن نشغلها من على تيوب.
ممكن أحسن ولا؟
تهيألي أفضل.
طيب خلاص همام في أمستردام.
ألو عايز صوت.
هي اللينك نفسه ما بيشتغلش؟
لا احنا ممكن نجرب من هنا أفضل.
نجرب يا ريت ممكن نجرب اللينك نفسه عشان ممكن
فين
ايوه نجرب اللينك التاني تاني واحد تاني لينك ده الاولاني نجرب اللينك التاني ده لا التاني واحد يعني هو عاملها على حته معينه
عايز اخد كله بس مش جاي كده
ايه بقى المشكله بتاعتك؟
لا انا كنت عايز اخد الكوبي احطه على تمام
ماشي اوكي. How many of you do not speak Arabic? How many do not speak Arabic? No one? Okay, just to make sure. I hope you're reflecting on what I'm saying at least. خلاص نجيب يوتيوب ونجيب الفيلم من يوتيوب اسهل حاجه مش كده؟
اخر حاجه
مش ده في عربي؟ بس نجيب همام في امستردام من يوتيوب.
بس عايز اجيب جوجل ممكن نجيبه بقى من جوجل من هنا.
نجيبها ايه؟
يعني حضرتك عايزه الفيلم كله ولا حاجه؟
انا عايزه حتى وانا بس ممكن اجيب، لو جبت لي يوتيوب الفيلم كله وانا اجيب منها الحته مش مشكله، انا عارفه هي فين.
هذا المفروض الفيلم كله.
لا خلاص طلعه كده. ممكن نجيبها بقى هنا خلاص. مش هحتاج الفينش لسه جزء تاني.
لا هيشتغل السبيكر بتاع
انا هحط دي على السماعه بتاعت المايك ما يطلعش
تليفون بس؟ لا ولا يهمك. لا خلاص كده مفيش مشكلة. Okay, so I think we'll not be able to show this first scene, but I already described what happened in this first scene. Now, as I said, this is all about his identity and how it's related to his language and the fact that he cannot speak Dutch. He does not look Dutch. It does not make it easy for him to pretend that he is. Now, after the same night, during this night, he's curious about a nightclub that he sees. He enters the nightclub and the waitress starts putting things on his plate while he's mesmerized by the show of acrobats. She then asks him in English for money. His reply is as follows, in English, bill? إيه؟ أنا ما طلبتش حاجة. What bill? I did not order anything. You kept putting things on my plate. No money. No money is said in English. I did not order anything is said in Arabic. The waitress then signals for 2 bouncers to come and beat him up. Note that the 2 words he utters in English are bill and money. He shouts for help in Arabic, saying desperately, lads, are there no Arabs here? A Saudi, a Kuwaiti, a Sudanese, any Libyans? Get away from me, kid. I am Egyptian. Lads, I am Egyptian. He shouts, get away from me. I am Egyptian. He appeals to this idea of ya gid'an, Egyptians, in Egyptian Arabic while saying that he's Egyptian. When Adrian first notices Hammam, Adrian's Dutch girlfriend turns his face away from the scene and asks him to finish his drink. But once Hammam again appeals to Gid'an and says that he's Egyptian, Adrian cannot refrain from interfering. So far, Adrian has not spoken, so Hammam and the audience do not know that he's also Egyptian. Adrian puts himself at risk by hitting the bodyguards to help the Egyptian. Hammam says, yes, give it to him. And he's sort of encouraging him to keep beating up this man. Hammam does not have the physique or strength of Adrian, so he remains in the background while the fighting goes on, and comments in both Arabic and English. His evaluation of Adrian comes in English when he says, good man. When the fighting intensifies and there are too many men against Adrian, Adrian stakes out a knife. The men all step back, and Adrian then leaves with Hammam and his girlfriend. Hammam latches to Adrian and follows after him, saying in English, I am Hammam. What's your name? Where you go? Adrian then speaks his first words, and they are in Egyptian colloquial Arabic, which says, just get in on the motorcycle and shut up. Hammam is taken by surprise by Egyptian Arabic and shouts in joy, long live the Arab Republic of Egypt. Quite a didactic scene, but extremely interesting linguistically. We'll just see this scene in a minute.
شوفي قصري وحياة راس جدي ايه لا ما حصلش حاجه. باللي انا ما طلبتش حاجه، انت اللي كل شويه تطلبي ماني. ماني نو ماني نو انا ما طلبتش. مش عايز دوشه. تحت جمهورية مصر العربية. همام بجهة شعبان. اهلا وسهلا. اهلا وسهلا. اتفضل يا فندم. اتفضل. طب اعمل ايه انا؟ اركب ومش عايز دوشه. ما يصحش. اركب بقى. يا مت...
Okay, I think you all got the idea of what I'm trying to render here. Okay. Presentation part we got in. Okay. Now, there are other movies that also deal with the same theme in different ways, but it's all about identity and it's all about language. And it's all about what we have in common, whether it's our ethnicity or whether it's our language or where we really come from. Another movie that I will not really go into details. Okay. Oops. Okay. Yeah. Is this one that you could see here? How could we? Oh, did I take it out? Yeah, perhaps this is better. Okay. Is this one Hassan Omor'os, 2008, which I'm sure Egyptians all know by heart. And again, the idea of this movie that you could change identities of these two people, the Christian and Muslim, they can all, each one of them play the other without people, having any doubts of this identity, because they don't have the phonological variation. It's only lexical religious words that they have to change. Quite a bold movie was produced in 2014, which is, excuse my French, as they translate it, La Mu'akhza, if any of you have seen this one. And this one deals with the issue in a much bolder way. The movie tackles religion and identity once more, and is about an affluent Egyptian boy, a 10-year-old boy, who loses his father, and with him, his affluent lifestyle, and then is forced to go to an Egyptian public school. The boy, Hani, happens to be Christian. While not realizing this could be an issue in his kind of social class, it's not really an issue, but going to the public school, he feels much more self-conscious. Once he's mingling with a less privileged class, he's also less secure about his religious identity and not sure whether he has a place in this specific school as a minority, both a social class minority and a religious minority. Throughout half the movie, he pretends to be a Muslim, even memorizing parts of the Quran in an attempt to please and make friends with the other students. However, even by pretending to be a Muslim, he also still fails to belong, simply because the other students notice he's different and from a different social class and a different community. Eventually, Hani himself realizes that he has to emphasize who he is, his own identity. After students realized that he was lying about his religion, and after being subjected to violent bullying, he and his mother consider immigrating to Canada. The scene in the embassy is essentially linguistic scene. The interview takes place supposedly in English, as you could imagine, but the interviewer is actually Egyptian, who's speaking to the boy and his mother in English. Now she asks point blank, did you have any kind of discrimination in Egypt? Both are silent. The mother says no, and so does the son proudly. The interview, when one asks this question and both of them say no, the interview takes place in English, as I said. The son, feeling uncomfortable with the questions that the interviewer asks, directly speaks in Arabic and says, "Are you Egyptian?" The interviewer replies, in English, "Yes." Hani then asks, "So why do you speak to us in English and not Arabic?" Again, in Arabic. The interviewer answers, again in English, "It's my job." Hani now feels really irritated by the whole situation and by, questioning his own identity and what he really wants. At that point, he corrects the English of the interviewer in a clear challenge to her and a clear establishment of his Egyptian identity, in which Arabic is the spoken language and pretending to be someone else will never be perfected. Interestingly, it is not actually Hani who decides to immigrate at the end, but he decides to stay and take his own place in society and eventually beat up the bullies at his school. But it's actually the person who does decide to immigrate is his math teacher, who's also bullied and brutally beaten, but who also happens to be a Muslim. Hani's teacher does immigrate and is clearly discriminated against, not because of his religion, but because he lacks family and connections. Hani decides to stay and fight for his place in Egypt. The clear metalinguistic discourse in the movie is worth a pause. As I said, it's very interesting, again, how they are sharing the same problems, they are sharing the same locality, ethnicity, and then when it comes to religion, it's somehow in the background, in some cases. Public discourse in Egypt foregrounds linguistic homogeneity as an indexical resource for Egyptians and then undermines the relationship undermines the relationship between linguistic diversity and religious diversity. The established indexical relationship in which in Egyptian public discourse between language and religion is next to nothing. Stylistic practices of both parties are dependent more on their small or big community or practice rather than on the religious affiliation. Language is used in public discourse as a marker of a unified large community or practice, which embraces both Christians and Muslims. Differences between both religious groups is limited to lexical religious morphemes and religious languages. Language can also be a salient feature that can be brought to the forefront, especially in times of conflict, to indicate that sectarian tensions are unfounded and that Christians and Muslims are of one common group. Sharing the same language also indicates sharing the same food, habits, morals, historical background, ethnicity, and location. It indicates living in a close-knit community, as Milroy calls. Language is impregnated with indexes and associations. Now, the second claim of Egyptian public discourse is that Egyptians are by nature religious, but religious differences between Christians and Muslims are not salient. And this is extremely interesting. So in the study I did of 48 patriotic songs in Egypt, I found out that the word Christian and Muslim is only mentioned in 2 of these songs. The rest refer to Christianity and Islam. All songs actually refer to Christianity and Islam, but they refer to them in different ways. So religion is actually indicated in 52% of the songs analyzed, but the strategies employed to refer to it render it in a more neutral, holistic, and inclusive manner. In 52% of cases, religion is alluded to in a neutral manner with no reference to a specific religion. So examples, God is with Egypt, for example. Or we all worship God, or we all worship one God. God protects Egypt. We pray to God. When songs refer to specific religions, they usually refer to both Christianity and Islam, and they do so indirectly by using place names or proper names. When both religions are mentioned in a song, there is mention of how Egypt is special in both religions and even reference to the religious scripture. Now, there are only 2 examples, as I said, in which the word Christian and the word Muslim occur, and the difference between them is very interesting in time, that is. The first one is the قوم يا مصري, مصر دايما بتناديك, Rise Egyptian, which was produced in 1919. A bitter and yet hopeful song, it urges Egyptians to wake up and take control of their country. Although written and composed before the discovery of the King Tut tomb, the song does refer to the glorious past and the glorious monuments of Egypt. I'm just going to say a little bit of the translation of the song. Rise up, Egyptian, Egypt is always calling you. Take my hand to victory. My victory is your duty. Cherish my glory, the glory that you lost with your own hands. What is the difference between Christians, Muslims, and Jews? Power is in unity, in being one and yet an army. Why, Egyptian, all your conditions are strange? You complain about poverty while you tread on gold. The song, of course, as you could see, did not just emphasize the relationship between Christians and Muslims, but also at that point in time, Jews. Much later, in the year 2010, there was the song فيها حاجة حلوة, something beautiful about Egypt, in which one of the beautiful things about Egypt is that a Muslim could break his fast in a Christian's house. So this is an example, again, of clear mention of a Christian and a Muslim. Other than that, all the other songs have either neutral mention of God, like مصر تتحدث عن نفسها, Egypt speaks about itself. God looked at me while I am guiding my sons, and they pulled upwards with all their might. Or mention of local areas that reference religion, like in this song, What is a Homeland? In that case, it's really location. What does homeland mean? It is tea with milk in a cafe in Al-Dahir district. It is an evening breeze in Al-Sayyida Mosque or the Monastery of the Angel. Again, place names. And sometimes locations that are also related to history. Now, what is interesting, of course, about patriotic songs is that they always portray a very kind of affluent and clean Egypt, like this famous one here. يبقى أنت أكيد في مصر. I'm sure you all, if you're Egyptians, you all know this song, in which there's this big table where the whole family is gathering together. And I think it will be, again, difficult for us to get the song. Let me try. No, I don't think it's going to be easy. Anyway, so in this specific song, the Christians are referred to in relationship to churches. When you find that churches are so full of history and light, and again, this idea of harmony and relationship between historicity, location, and religion. So basically, just to conclude, I would like to say that through linguistic resources, mainstream public discourse highlights in more than one way that Christians and Muslims in Egypt belong to the same ethnic group, share the same community, habits, and history. Language can be used as a resource to provide a stance that positions individuals as belonging or not belonging to a group. It was clear that in public discourse, the ideological assumption that there is no linguistic variation based on religion in Egypt is emphasized and spelled out, in some cases with phonological examples. Public discourse is, of course, varied, and challenges to this perception of a holistic Egyptian identity are immediate. However, what has been referred to in this talk is the mainstream popular public discourse that is available to all Egyptians and that Egyptians are exposed to in different contexts, in schools, in cinemas, television broadcasts, songs memorized by all members of the community. Thank you so much. Okay, part of this talk comes from my book, Language and Identity in Modern Egypt, just to give you an idea. Thank you. Any questions?
Any questions?
Thank you, Doctor, for the inspiring and informative lecture. May I ask you a question? What makes it different here in Egypt other than Iraq and Lebanon? You said that, or you stated that Iraq and Lebanon experienced conflicts or religious conflicts between different doctrines. Here in Egypt, we have two major religions, but we don't have the same problem. It's mild, the problem. Actually, there's a problem, but I think it's mild, the problem. It's not quite problem. So what makes it that way? Thank you.
Okay, this is a very good question. Now, the thing I want to emphasize is two things. What I want to present is not my own opinion. It's just what public discourse, the perception of public discourse. So, it could be that there are problems. It's just that public discourse is showing us this image. And this is what I'm interested in, public discourse. When it comes to other countries, what I depend on is linguistic studies. So in that case, it's not actually public discourse, but linguistic studies that has been done, for example, in Bahrain, or the classic study of Abu Haidar about Muslims and Christians in Baghdad, where she actually is showing us linguistically phonological, syntactic, and semantic differences that are built on religious groups, built on religion as a sociolinguistic variable. Does that make sense? So this is the kind of difference that, so these are two different things. These are actually natural ways of speaking, while what I am trying to discuss is perceptions, public discourse perceptions. Interestingly, there aren't any studies really that I know of that discuss how Christians, for example, speak differently from Muslims phonologically. There are no studies that show that. Does that mean there is no phonological difference? Coming from Egypt, yes, I can tell you that it's much more about social class and about locality and where you come from than it is about, whether you're just a Christian or a Muslim.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Reem, for the interesting presentation, of course. My question is about the same issue again, which is a very sensitive issue. Historically speaking, the relationship between Muslims and Christians in Egypt have been a good example. However, the concept of racism or discrimination might not be very clear in the minds of people. Sometimes a Muslim talking to another Muslim, referring to a person as being Christian, the idea of just mentioning in the conversation that a person is Christian is, to me, carries some kind of discrimination in a sense. So what do you think about we always deny as Muslims that there is discrimination in Egypt, and sometimes we weasel out of the question by saying we are all discriminated against in this country.
So, I mean, if I pick up from where you stopped about, the fact that we always say that there are no problems, why is it that we say there are no problems? Because of public discourse. This is how important public discourse is in our life. It's because we study this in school. This is the propagated discourse that we have all around us. That's a healthy thing in a way. I mean, that of course, denying problems is not healthy, but having the concept that, in publicly, it's not really acceptable, to speak in a bad way about one religion or the other in kind of mainstream public discourse, in a way, that's a very positive thing, I would think. But that doesn't mean there aren't any problems, of course. I mean, as the movies are showing, especially the newer ones, they are dealing with the problems in a much more bolder and sort of subtle way as well.
Good evening. Thanks a lot for the inspiring and the great lecture. My question is, do you think that during the last 3 years, especially during the 25th of January revolution, has any kind of change happened to the relationship between Muslims and Christians in Egypt? This is number one. And was it positive or negative change? The second point is, what are the real challenges of the relationship between Muslims and Christians? And is there, according to you, because you're a researcher in this field, is there any kind of segregation for Coptic in Egypt, like not giving them top jobs in army or other stuff? Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. I mean, the problem is that I'm not really specialized in any of these topics, so I don't know how to answer any of them. What I look at as a sociolinguist is only the relationship between language and how language is sort of mediating between how we would like others to see us, basically. And so to me, I just look at public discourse and I analyze how, Muslims and Christians are somehow represented in this public discourse. And so I wouldn't be able to be the best person to answer these questions. I think they are very important and valid questions, but I think someone perhaps who's an anthropologist might be able to answer them a bit better. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Reem, for clarifying what a sociolinguist is actually looking into. My question is somehow taps into other themes, but it's kind of related. It's how do you see the relation between actors creating this image for themselves? Because deep inside, when we go to deeper classes of the society, we actually see that there is a great schism between Muslims and Christians, and then the differences of their ideas that they have created for themselves are completely different from what people from urban areas, for instance, propagate. So how do you see this kind of tension? How do you see this kind of break? There's so many parallel worlds to, there are so many parallel public discourses, in fact, if we can say it this way.
Could you repeat again, which discourses were you?
In public discourse is actually split into so many several levels based on class, particularly.
Okay. Okay, that's a sociolinguistic question. So I think personally, being a sociolinguist and coming from Egypt, if you ask me what is the most salient characteristic or independent variable in Egypt, it's the variable that discrimination is based upon, all kinds of discrimination is based upon, that even public discourse does not respect, I would say is social class. I think social class is so salient in Egypt. And again, it's unfortunately sometimes even public discourse. And that's when you become a little bit uneasy as a sociolinguist, when public discourse is not necessarily being politically correct. So it's all about being politically correct. So while public discourse is very careful with the relationship between different religions in Egypt, we do need to consider and reconsider and re-examine the way that we are as individuals in public discourse, referring to different social classes in Egypt. And how in public discourse, which is very shocking sometimes to me, you could refer to a specific social class with associations that are extremely negative just because it's a poorer social class and get away with it. These are issues that are, I think, really immediate for us to consider. Okay.
I have actually two questions.
Come here so I could see you all better.
Since you were speaking about the public discourse and you were speaking that public discourse includes multiple actors, I was wondering about what you think about the influence, the strengths, difference in strengths of influence between different actors. So, for example, the independent preachers in both groups and religions. So, independent preachers, independent preachers of Islam and independent preachers of Christianity, and how they influence the public discourse, and then we can actually very easily distinguish ourselves as Egyptians if we are Christians or Egyptian or Muslims, just by replying to Salaam alaikum or by saying thank you. So, for example, Christians normally feel more comfortable saying Nashkur Rabbina. Muslims say normally Alhamdulillah. Of course, I'm an architect, so I'm not from that background at all, but I'm interested in identity, so if you can actually elaborate on that. And one last thing is that you were focusing on movies and patriotic songs and how they represent the identity, but then I'm skeptical about how these actually are absorbed by the people, because most of them are actually some sort of official representation rather than actually what people, it's like wishes rather than actually honest representation that people think and believe of. So how do you think this can actually be a true representation of the cohesion in the community?
Okay, I never claimed it's true. I just said that it's public discourse, but it's very popular. So movies like Hassan Omor'os, you just look at the YouTube, how many times people actually watch them, or you look at La Mu'akhza, excuse my French or whatever, however it's translated. And these are very popular movies. I wouldn't think they are not really ingrained in the Egyptian identity because they are so popular. Everyone saw them. Everyone, somehow memorized lines out of them. However, I do agree with you. This is mainstream public discourse. And there is a great difference between extreme public discourse, extreme discourse, and mainstream public discourse. And when the borderline between both is blurred, then it becomes really risky. So like if public discourse starts to discriminate against one group, then you think there is something wrong. There's something seriously wrong. But if extreme discourse is there and, discriminating or saying horrible things about the other group, it's sort of expected that you always have extreme discourse. In all societies, there are extreme discourses. But it's public, it's main public discourse. Now the question is whether public discourse represents reality or not. It may not necessarily reflect reality as it is, but it's definitely very important in our perception of reality. The way that we somehow, it becomes ingrained in us because we perceive it in movies. I also don't think that the movies did not really show problems, like Hassan Omor'os or La Mu'akhza. They are dealing with, with issues that are very thorny in a way, but they are also dealing with it, showing that the differences are not built on ethnicity, not built on language, not built on locality, but just trivial differences. However, when it comes to words like Salaam alaikum, these are, of course, religious lexical words. And yes, we do expect them to be different. It's impossible not to have them different. However, the idea is that would you be able to tell, if a Christian does not say, Nushkur Rabbina, would you be able to tell that he's Christian or she's Christian just by the way they speak? No. I'm sure that, you've all had situations when you had a friend for a long time and then you discover that he's from a different religion or she's from a different religion. And I think that's what they're playing on, which is not the case, by the way. It's not the case, as I said, in all countries in the Arab world. There are countries that you could tell just by the way they speak. So I think that's what is really emphasized. Okay.
Hey, I just want to ask something. Do you think that public discourse, the way it is now, is undermining other religious minorities? Or is it invisibilizing it? Invisibilizing them?
I mean, like, give me an example.
No, I don't know. Like, for example, not talking about other religions or just talking about Christians and Muslims. Or do you think, like, for example, to be Egyptian, or the identity of the Egyptian is strictly related to Muslim and Christians and not other thing in the pub? Like, is that reflected in the public discourse or not? Is that talked or not? What do you think?
I'm sure that there are other religious groups that exist in Egypt. They are not a big minority for public discourse to actually start tackling them and discussing them because they are, important, because it's just a big minority. You need to be able to somehow find a holistic way of dealing with each other. So I think that's the reason why I wouldn't think it's really necessarily there. However, as you could see in the first song, 1919, what's the difference between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. This has actually now been changed. In the, whenever the song is sung now, they change it a little bit. So it seems that there was a time when Jews were a substantial amount in Egypt, when public discourse also spoke about them in a kind of, with Christians and with Muslims as somehow sharing the same ethnicity, locality, and other features, character traits, but not necessarily religion.
Thank you so much. Let me first thank you for this exciting topic and discussing this issue, which is very sensitive. Yeah. Well, as far as I know, that identity has three pillars: language and religion and land. So my question, what will happen if we will deform the language and deform our religion and say that our land is a big lie? I myself have, if I consider myself that I have three passports, one Egyptian passport and one American and one from African country. So how can I identify my identity? This is my question. Another comment related to the La Mu'akhza movie, which was shown here, that, the kid in the school, his name was Hani Abdallah. And, Hani
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I really can't hear very well. If you could come a little bit, perhaps, and ask your question again.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm just talking about, the kid in the movie. His name is Hani Abdallah. The students themselves in the classrooms, they don't know that Abdullah is a Christian name because it actually is not a common name among the Coptics here in my country. So selecting the language or the names for Christians or for names for the Muslims and so on, such to identify, the religion for, the Egyptian citizens here. Once again, please, I'm just asking about, if I have three passports, how can I identify my identity?
Oh, that's a very big question. It's really, I'm sure that we all tackling the same issue all the time, Even the people who have one passport, there are times when they look and, contemplate and think about who they really are. And so the issue of identity is very complicated, I would say. Like, for example, in this movie that I'm sure you've seen, and, Amerika Shikabika, when he says, يعني إيه كلمة وطن? What is it that, defines who I am? And for him, it was not, it was all about patterns of living, the areas that he knows, his mother, his family, So I think that was a kind of subtle way of thinking about what an identity is, but definitely it's a very complicated question and very difficult to answer, for sure. But I remember the movie La Mu'akhza, the boy was also called Hani Abdallah, and that's why they didn't realize whether he's Christian or Muslim. And so that's a fascinating example in which, people cannot, and that's the point. If you can't recognize people, if they have a neutral name, and you can't recognize what religion they come from by the way they speak or look, that's what public discourse is trying to emphasize. That since you can't, there is no significant difference, basically. Because language is such an important resource in the way we express ourselves. So if you speak in a similar way, then it also means you have something that is very similar.
Yeah, I have a similar issue regarding identity. I mean, I understand that you work on a socio-linguistic level, but see, from an anthropological point of view, identity is fluid. You can be Saidi and be in Amsterdam and refer to yourself as Egyptian, but you can be Saidi and refer as Saidi in a context sitting in Cairo with fellow Saidis. So I do not know if that is paying tribute. I found this idea of identity you were presenting fairly static. I also thought that the Baya citation is very, very unlucky because it's highly idealized. This is the way people in Shupra present themselves when they speak to outsiders. We are in unity, we are one community. I was really I found it a very unlucky thing. So I would like to know first, how do you describe identity? For the second, I was thinking maybe analyzing a political or a public discourse which is right. There is no difference made between Christians and Muslims. We would have to look and go further why that is the case. And maybe you could hint to that, because otherwise I feel it all is a bit in limbo. Do I make sense?
Could you say the last part again?
Because I think you stopped in your presentation where it was getting interesting at the question as to why. Why is there no difference made? And I think this is a political, national level. And I felt that is the next step you should have made.
Why linguistically there is no difference?
When you look at the public discourse, why is that not an issue, the differences? The religious differences. So I felt maybe that would be the next step to make.
No, actually, I think I answered this question at the very beginning, because this is coming from the book.
So maybe it was my fault.
No. So basically, the reason why, that's a very good question. The reason why there isn't a difference that is built on religion is that the religious groups do not form communities in Egypt. And they are Egypt is very dense. So, for example, you don't have one whole apartment block in Mohandesin that would only have Christians. It's impossible. Or one whole apartment block that would only have Muslims. I mean, it just becomes really, if it's like 25 stories, and they are all, 25 stories apartment block, it's really quite difficult not to have the diversity. So that means that you interact all the time with the other religion. So linguistically, we call it, according to Milroy, this is a dense and multiplex community. People are interacting, they're working together, they're a professor, it's your doctor, they are all working together, they're living in the same area. So it's very difficult then to have a different linguistic characteristics. The only time when you can have different linguistic characteristics is when you start to segregate. And segregation is it's impossible in Egypt, because there is no place to segregate. So lucky us. I mean, that's a good thing. In a way, to be crowded is very good for us, because there is no place to segregate, really. So, yeah. Sorry? At the level of? No, but at the time of the war, Lebanon there is West Beirut and there is East Beirut. And of course, it had all the Christians were living in East Beirut and the Muslims were living in West Beirut. So the moment you do that, you expect linguistic variation. And that's why, you do have, of course, you have lots of dialects in Egypt, but they're not built on religion. So the Saidis, whether Christians or Muslims, would speak in Saidi dialects, which are a lot of dialects, actually. So, but it's not built on religion, it's built on locality. Even within Cairo, of course, as you well know, there are different dialects within Cairo, or accents within Cairo, based on social class, but they're not based on religion. So do you get that point? So there are differences. There will always be differences. But the differences, as I said, I would think social class is much more highlighted.
Thanks so much, Professor, for the insightful lecture. And my question is actually related to social media and code switching. A lot of my Muslim friends, they share text from the Quran, which is originally written in Arabic. They share the verses in English version, while a lot of my Christian friends, they share verses from the Bible and Arabic text. Does this represent any sort of reflection of identity, or it has nothing to do with identity?
From research that I have read and from research that some of my students are doing, it seems like code switching between English and Arabic is not related to religious affiliations or even whether you're conservative religiously or not, which is very interesting in a way. I would have expected that this is not the case, but it seems to be, so it's not really related. Yeah.
In brief, this public discourse is aiming to prove that Egypt is the land of peace, religious tolerance, etc. But one thing I find it quite peculiar, if this is a well-known fact, so why in big celebrations or like feasts or like we have Eid al-Adha, whilst they have Eid al-Qiyamah, why all those churches is protected by policemen? On the other side, mosques are not protected.
I didn't get the question. I don't think I can hear again very well.
Why do we always protect Christians in their big celebrations, whilst on the other hand, we as Muslims, we never had protection. We never felt we need to be protected in our celebration.
Well,
is that a kind of discrimination? Do they feel they are like a minority? They may be attacked by others, or this is just a routine thing? Or?
Again, I don't think I can answer the question because I'm not an expert, unfortunately, in this.
Okay, thanks.
But usually, we think linguistically, it's always the minority that needs protection. The majority is much more, you know, there are a lot, the number is bigger. But again, I'm not really an expert in this, so I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reem, for your lecture. I'd like to ask you if you consider studying the same discourse as a multimodal discourse, not just verbally, but visually as well. As you know, facial expressions and body language play a very important role in reflecting the affinity or enmity between Christians and Muslims, and also friendship and brotherhood. I remember in the movie of La Mu'akhza, once they knew he is a Christian boy, they said, الواد هاني طلع كفتس, also العظم الأزرق or الأربعة ريشة. Alongside with their facial expressions, there were a lot of enmity and affinity to Christians. In contrary to other films like film Hindi between Ahmed Adam and Salah Abdullah, their facial expressions and body language, they reflect a lot of friendship and brotherhood. So I think this would be considered.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
would be another topic to examine, for sure, definitely interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor.
One more,
Okay.
we can take on. Yeah, go on.
Is it available?
It's okay.
Okay. We have seen in Hassan Omor's movie that there was some kind of symposium in which Christians and Muslims aims for coexistence. And when they walking in at the doors of the conference, they were envy each others in some kind of humorous scene for taking the positions as Muslims, and the Christians say so and so. And when they get in the hall, the two clergymen Christians and two clergymen Muslims raise them saying Yahya al-Hiyal ma salib. Does his apparent coexistence seems to be manipulation, and can sociolinguistics tackle this?
I think
does
this
that make
is,
sense?
Yeah, I mean, this movie again is dealing, I mean, like a couple of people asked about this issue of how about the tension?
I think
And
it's some kind of apparent coexistence.
Well, that's the interesting part. So while they are saying that, deep down there is tension, and they each feel that they are being treated unfairly. However, at the very end of the movie, we have the Christian and Muslim also holding hands, again, in spite of all the chaos, knowing that if they don't exist together, they will not exist. So it's almost the same as Tahilal al-Ma'asali, but done in a much more subtle way, by exposing the stereotype, but at the same time propagating it. Do you get what I mean? It's almost like doing both at the same time. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
We would like to thank Dr. Reem for such a great lecture and for her time. And thank you all for joining us today, and wish you join us in our upcoming lectures, inshallah. Thank you all.